Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined at the podium by the Air Chief of Police, Brian Gill, by Dave Solid, who is the Chief of our Cold Case Unit, and by Massachusetts State Police Detective Lieutenant William Donahue. Just over 45 years ago, on May 21st of 1980, Katerina Reitz-Brow, whose photo is to my left, was found brutally murdered at her home in Air. The investigation of that crime revealed that she had been killed sometime between 7:10 in the morning when her husband left for work and 10:45 in the morning when her body was found in her home. And that is a photo of her home on the far left. It was determined that Mrs. Brow had been stabbed 30 times. 5 of those stab wounds penetrated her heart. In addition, she had repeatedly been struck with a blunt instrument. The medical examiner testified at an earlier proceeding that Mrs. Brow had died probably closer to 7:10 than to 10:45, that she was alive when she was struck with that blunt instrument, and that she lived for somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes after she was stabbed, and being conscious at least half of that time. There was no sign of forced entry into the home, but there were many signs of a struggle. Mrs. Brow's purse, which contained cash and jewelry, and which she normally kept in the linen closet, was missing, as well as a large sum of cash, which she was known to keep between sheets, clean sheets, in the linen closet. There was no other sign that the house had been searched or that anything else had been taken. One of the murder weapons, the knife, was found in a wastebasket in the home. At the time of the murder, police identified a suspect who lived in a home near Mrs. Brow and also worked at the Park Street Diner in Air, which she had frequented. That suspect, Kenneth William Waters, was arrested on October 13th of 1982, and following a trial here in Middlesex County was convicted of murder on May 11th, 1983. Mr. Waters' conviction was vacated on March the 15th, 2001, when DNA analysis determined that a blood stain recovered from the scene had been left by a male, but it could not have been left by Kenneth Waters. It's important to note that at the time of the original investigation, the crime laboratory was only able to do blood typing, not DNA testing. It had determined that that stain was left by someone who had type O blood, which Mr. Waters did. And that was the end of the proceedings at that point. Mr. Waters' conviction was vacated and the case remained unsolved. In March of 2022, the cold case unit of our office turned to using the cutting-edge forensic technique known as forensic investigative genetic genealogy to try to identify that male who had left his blood at the crime scene. Working with the forensic chemists at Parabon Nanolabs, the investigators were able to isolate a genetic line that identified 2 potential suspects, a pair of brothers, both of whom were deceased. The investigators successfully identified 2 living relatives of those brothers and secured their voluntary cooperation in providing their DNA. Using those standards, scientists at Bodie Laboratory were able to determine to an overwhelming statistical likelihood that one of those brothers, Joseph Leo Boudreau, was the source for the DNA that had been left at the crime scene. That DNA evidence was at least 660 million times more likely to have come from Joseph Leo Boudreau as compared to any untested or unrelated individuals. Then investigated Mr. Boudreau and determined that he was a longtime resident of Massachusetts. He was born in Natick in 1943, so he was 27 years old at the time that he was in Mrs. Brow's home and had committed that crime. He'd worked in the Framingham area as an adult. He was convicted of armed robbery in the state of New Hampshire in 1975. And in 1987, he moved to the Algonquin, Maine area, where he lived until the time of his death at the age of 61 in 2004. Investigation has revealed no known link between Mr. Boudreau and Mr. Waters. Over the past for decades, this case has received an enormous amount of attention, both with respect to the initial crime, the trial of Mr. Waters, the vacating of Mr. Waters' conviction, and the fact that this story was made into a movie. Today, what's important is that we want to keep the focus on Katerina Reeds-Brown. She was a hardworking wife, mother, and sister who died violently in her own home. We had the opportunity to speak to her family today, and these were to provide some answers to them after a very long and painful journey for them. And we are very grateful to the work done with our partners, both work of our cold case unit as well as our partners with the Air Police Department, the state police, the laboratories, and those individuals who voluntarily provided us with DNA. I think there are really three messages to this case. One is the importance of the integrity of our convictions. In this case, this is an incident where at some point the conviction was vacated. We could have pretty easily just left the case to stand at that point. But in this office, we don't forget when somebody comes into Middlesex County and somebody attacks someone and they violently lose their life. And it's also a testament to the persistence of the work that we have done. It's important that we are able to provide answers, that we are able to identify the person responsible for Mrs. Brown's death, even though that individual has passed away and can't be held accountable through the criminal justice process. And also that we now can be clear as to who the killer of Mrs. Brown was. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Gill for some remarks regarding the community.
So in 1980, this brutal murder of Katerina Brown shook the town of Air to its core. And since the conviction in this case was vacated in 2001, this has been assigned and reassigned to many investigators who their job was to review the investigation as it was, to follow up on any leads that had been developed, and apply known investigative techniques at the time that they received the case. But it was really the breakthrough that came when the forensic, investigative, genetic, genealogy, DNA testing was applied to the evidence that was recovered in this case. And this ultimately led us to today's announcement. I'm thankful on behalf of the town that we may be able to finally bring some closure to the Brown family and a measure of justice to Katerina.
Thank you, Chief. And I neglected to mention the photograph on the right is a photograph of Mr. Brown. Anybody have any questions? Thank you. Thank you for joining us.